Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
So is it banned or not banned? The United States government passed a law banning the popular social media app TikTok. It went into force over the weekend and the app disappeared. But as of Monday, it was back up and running for American users after Donald Trump signed an executive order to stop the Justice Department from enforcing the ban. That was an about-face for Mr. Trump, who once supported barring the Chinese-owned platform for American users. Now Trump is singing a new tune, and for the moment, millions of American TikTokers are allowed to keep posting and viewing content, even though the government says it's a massive national security threat to the United States. So what's Trump up to? And what's going to happen to TikTok? I'm David Smith. Today on The Big Story, we're getting answers about the TikTok ban. Helping us get to the bottom of this today is Carmi Levy. He's a Canadian tech analyst and journalist. Hi, Carmi.
Great to be with you, David. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time on such a busy day and a busy week. So the segment of this whole Trump inauguration story that we're looking at today is kind of a side angle to the whole play, but it is important. It's a platform that's used by 170 odd million Americans every day. We're talking about TikTok and the TikTok ban, or is it a ban? So, Carmi, as I understand it, the TikTok ban was legislation passed under the Biden administration. Then there was a court challenge. Last week, the court ruled against TikTok and upheld the ban. It went into effect and the app did go dark for some users over the weekend. But then yesterday, after his inauguration, President Trump reversed it? Or can you walk us through what happened there?
Yeah, so it's known as the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act, or PAFACA. And basically, it's a law that was enacted by the Biden administration last April. It received bipartisan support. So Democrat, Republican, doesn't matter. They all wanted this in place. And the reason being is that we know that TikTok is a Chinese-owned application. ByteDance is the company that owns them, and they are Chinese-based. And we know that Chinese companies must sign a deal with the Chinese government that if the government comes calling, asking for data that is collected by these companies, they must provide it. There's no negotiation. They can't say no. This is the deal they make in order to have the right to do business in China. Now, ByteDance all along has denied that it has ever signed such a deal, that it would ever hand over the data, or that it's even been asked. But we've seen reporting, particularly from the Wall Street Journal, that suggests very strongly that there is evidence that Chinese government officials at various points have had access to end user data. And we know that the app itself, compared to other social media apps out there, and every app does collect data, of course, but TikTok is what's known as an aggressive data harvester, collects more information from other parts of the device. And of course, we know that the Chinese government uses mass data surveillance to achieve its geopolitical aims. They use it to, of course, control their own people. But of course, 170 million Americans soaking up that much data from that many phones would give the Chinese government reason to, think. So the U.S. government has been concerned about this kind of surveillance for a long time and wanted to use TikTok as an example, because TikTok is the largest, most popular example of a Chinese app. And so it became essentially the government's whipping boy. What changed as we got down to the election, and of course, as Inauguration Day approached, is that Donald Trump, who originally started this back during his first administration, he in fact signed an executive order in 2020 ordering the company to sell itself or be at risk of a shutdown. The government would order them to shut down if they didn't sell themselves to an American company. He had a change of heart during the election campaign last year. His campaign used TikTok to share videos that ultimately resonated with younger voters, particularly younger male voters. And so now, all through the campaign, Trump has been trumpeting TikTok as he now likes the app. He wants to save the app. And so that what happened was that this law was in place. Donald Trump can't get rid of the law, couldn't do it before, can't do it now, but he could make a promise saying, hey, when the deadline is the day before I'm president, but when I am president, I'll sign an executive order, buy you some more time to find an American buyer, and at least you can keep the lights on in the interim. So that's why we saw that flip-flop. It went dark because they didn't want to be in violation of the law. But then Donald Trump made statements early Saturday morning saying the executive order is on his docket and he will save the company. And so they felt emboldened. They received reassurances that they would not be prosecuted if they flipped everything back on, which is why TikTok came back on before Donald Trump assumed the White House, which is kind of where we're at now, is that now that he has signed the executive order, the company has another 75 days until April 5th to find a buyer, or we're right back where we started, where if they don't find a buyer, the law, which Donald Trump cannot make go away, will force them to shut themselves down again. And this time there will be no extension because there is no such provision in the law.
Right. So Trump hasn't reversed the ban. He hasn't canceled it. What he did amounts to hitting the pause button. I actually have some of the text of the executive order here in front of me. It says, I hereby order the Attorney General not to take any action on behalf of the United States to enforce the act for 75 days from the date of this order to permit my administration an opportunity to determine the appropriate course of action with respect to TikTok. End quote. So what do you think that means? What would an appropriate course of action be with respect to TikTok? What kind of other options might there be out there?
President Trump is looking to buy himself and the company enough time to find a buyer. That's really what this is all about, is that TikTok, the company, did not want to sell itself. When the law went into effect last April, when it was signed into law, ByteDance said, we don't want to sell. And the Chinese government said, we will not allow ByteDance to sell its American operations. And so I think they were almost engaged in a high-stakes game of brinkmanship with the U.S. government. And TikTok did not actively seek a buyer. There were no negotiations for it. Lots of rumors about who might be kicking the tires, but no one actually sat down and tried to negotiate a deal in advance of the January 19th deadline. And so essentially what happens now is, now that there's a new president in town, Donald Trump gets to orchestrate that, gets to get the possible buyers around the table, gets to negotiate things like how much money will change hands, what technology will and will not be included in an eventual deal, because we know Chinese government won't allow the algorithm to be included in any sale. Which means that whoever buys the company better have the technology chops to create a new one. And even then, it probably won't be the same as the one that we use today. So there are lots of moving parts here. It's a very complex negotiation. They now have 74 days to broker that. And of course, Donald Trump, it gives him an opportunity to score a pretty big high-profile win for himself in the early days of his administration. That ultimately is what this has always been about for Mr. Trump, is that it allows him to swoop in and be seen as the hero, and orchestrate something that allows TikTok to keep the lights on beyond this 75-day deadline.
Okay. On the why of it all, the Biden administration, nonpartisan support, there are concerns in the U.S. government about national security, about data security, about political interference, election interference. What is the relationship between ByteDance, which is the company that owns TikTok, and the Chinese state? You mentioned the algorithm. I did want to ask you about that. I've read that is it the Chinese state that says that algorithm can't be sold, or is it ByteDance that's refusing to sell it? What's the relationship between the company and the regime in China?
ByteDance doesn't want to be seen as an agent of the Chinese government. And so whenever asked in North America about their relationship, they'll say very clearly, we're not in bed with the Communist Party of China. We're not at the bidding of the Chinese government. Whereas the Chinese government, of course, has a very different perspective, makes it very clear. They're a Chinese company. These are the terms that all Chinese companies must adhere to. So hard to really tell, because this isn't like in the US or in Canada where corporate structure, corporate relationships, who's involved, where the money flows. It's a lot easier to track that. And I say this as a journalist, it's what I do. You can very easily find that information. In many cases, it's a matter of public record. In the case of TikTok and ByteDance, that is not the case at all. So very opaque, not transparent at all. And ByteDance wants you to believe that the American operation, TikTok US, is separate and distinct from the rest of the company. Yet it's pretty clear that there are, background connections right back to China and right back to the Chinese government. So it's difficult to tell. And the fact that this is China means that there will be national security concerns. This isn't an American app where the data gets stored on an American server and then used just to serve up ads that we may or may not want, asking us to buy things that we probably can't afford and don't need. This is China, and they can and will use data against us to interfere with an election, to gain economic advantage, to gain political advantage. This is China's game, and frankly, they're terrifyingly good at it. And they've been doing it for years. And so, TikTok as an agent of the Chinese government, it's a well-known threat. National security analyses, both in the U.S. and in Canada, have put that threat into very stark relief, make it very clear how that apparatus works. And the fact is, where there's smoke, there's fire. And if you are at all concerned about foreign governments using consumer data, seemingly innocuous consumer data, to do their bidding, look no further than China, because they established the template for other countries to follow.
What is so important about TikTok's algorithm? I read one analysis piece where the author suggested if the algorithm is not sold to a U.S. entity looking to buy the American operations, if that sale doesn't come with the algorithm, there's not much of a point in doing the sale, because the algorithm is central to some of those concerns about national security. Can you walk us through that?
Yep, that's an entirely valid point to make. And think of the algorithm as the secret sauce of TikTok. It's what makes TikTok as special as it is. And the algorithm in this case, it tries to guess what you want to watch next. And so anyone who's ever used TikTok, you pick up your phone, you think you're going to watch one or two videos, but next thing you know, 3 hours have gone by because you've been watching one after the other after the other. And what the algorithm is doing, it's taking information from all parts of the app, from the phone, all sorts of cues based on your activities on your device. And it's trying to figure out, what do you want to watch next? And so it has supernaturally capable insight into what makes you tick. What do you want to see? Now, if you think about that, it's easy to dismiss it. Oh, who cares? It's just about watching videos. But if you think about that, that's incredible insight into the mind of whoever's using that phone. Now, multiply that by 170 million and think about how that information, that giant pile of data, assembled by an algorithm, can be used in ways against us. And so we think it's trivial, but in reality, collectively, it gives governments great insight into how the American people think. And it also allows them to perhaps sway them to think in ways they want them to think. And so the algorithm is really the engine that drives this entire data surveillance apparatus. And so on the one hand, if an American company buys TikTok and the algorithm doesn't come along with it and everything gets firewalled from China, that addresses a lot of the national security concerns that we've been talking about for years around TikTok. The flip side, though, is that TikTok, the app, probably won't be as good at picking what you are going to want to watch next, because it won't be as good at tracking your information, at storing that information. And so it might be safer from a national security perspective, but it'll probably be a lousier experience for end users, which means they may not want to use it at all by the time April comes around and an American company does, in fact, buy them, if they do buy them.
And I think we should mention some of the stakes for people who use this app. As I understand it, and correct me if I'm wrong, please, users in Canada, regardless of how big their following is on TikTok, they don't make a tremendous amount of money from the app directly in Canada. But in America, they have something called a creator fund, where they essentially, the app TikTok will pay users for the number of views that they can generate, and then they also partner with private companies to do brand endorsements and that sort of thing. And they can make millions of dollars in some cases. It's quite lucrative, and there are many people who rely on posting on TikTok for their livelihood. And if the app were banned, those people would effectively lose their main source of income. Is that correct?
That's very correct. So many other digital influencers or content creators, largely in the U.S. For many of them, that is their career, and some of them are making 6, 7, and more figure salaries based on having a lot of followers and cranking out a lot of content that those followers want to see. And so, where they get the revenue from is twofold. On the one hand, they will get it from serving up videos that have ads attached to them that hundreds of thousands or millions of people will see. So advertisers will pay a premium for that. And if you are part of the Creator Rewards program, you will be able to receive a percentage of that based on your follower base. You'll also be able to make money by scoring deals with advertisers who want to deliver their message to your followers. So if you are, say, a beauty influencer, then advertisers who maybe sell makeup or beauty regimes or spas might be interested in collaborating with you on campaigns that deliver ads specifically to your audience, or include product placements and other forms of promotion within the content itself. Here in Canada, it's a somewhat different story because the Creator Rewards program isn't available in the same form in Canada. So generating revenue directly off of ads in Canada, not quite as straightforward as it is in the US. We do, however, have offices in Toronto and Vancouver, and they do work with influencers in Canada. And they have something called the Creator Fund program, which if you have 50,000 followers or more, TikTok's employees in Canada are able to work with you to arrange collaborations. And so money is being made in Canada, maybe not as much as it is in the US, but it is still a significant economy here. And there are still people for whom, north of the border, TikTok is their way of life, their career. And even if you're not an influencer or a content creator, you might be a business. And in Canada, there are hundreds of thousands of small businesses that use the platform as a means of reaching their audience, advertising their products and services. And it's in many ways, TikTok is an e-commerce platform. And because the Canadian economy is so influenced or so skewed toward the small to mid-size space, TikTok has emerged as a really efficient tool for them. And so if anything happens to TikTok in the US, even though the law only applies there, if the American audience is somehow compromised, if they're not engaged with the technology as much, or if it goes dark, or if something else happens, that directly affects Canadians who are trying to sell into the American market or collaborate with players south of the border. So it affects us regardless. These are global applications, and there will be global impact no matter what happens in the U.S.
Yeah, a lot of stakes outlined there for an awful lot of people, and it's not just the executives at the top level or the Chinese ownership benefiting from this. It is part of the economy, whether we like it or not. What is the Canadian government saying about TikTok, Carmi? Is our government looking at some kind of action like the U.S. has taken?
They haven't said anything directly as the clock ticked down to the January 19th deadline, and certainly as Donald Trump has taken office, they're largely focused on other issues, like a potentially impending trade war. And so there is no official Canadian government position on what's happening with TikTok in the U.S. But that doesn't mean changes aren't afoot here, because we know the Canadian government late last year ordered TikTok to shut down those offices in Toronto and Vancouver. They said Canada had engaged in a national security review, and the results of that national security review compelled them to order those offices to be shut down, even though the app itself will continue to be available in Canada. There is no law in Canada on the books, similar to the one in the US, that will force the company to sell itself to a non-Chinese owner. So Canadians will still be able to use the app going forward. What might happen, though, is they might lose access to the support of those offices. If you're a digital influencer and you're working with a TikTok employee in Canada, to maybe create an advertising campaign or a promotion, or if you're a business and you want to craft new ads. There are 700 employees in Canada who are working directly with Canadians to make that happen. And the company is challenging that in Canada. They've sued the federal government to stop the shutdown. So for now, those offices remain functional. But it is possible that Canadian TikTokers could lose local support if ultimately TikTok Canada loses the battle. So it's a different kind of battle here. We're not at risk of losing the app, but we are at risk of losing local support for the app, which is ironic considering that Canada has long complained to big tech companies. You come into Canada, you set up shop, you make the app available, but you don't invest in the community. Well, TikTok invested in 2 cities and hired hundreds of Canadians to do these jobs. And now the federal government is telling them to go away. So which one is it? It seems, somewhat two-sided for the way the Canadian government is proceeding, especially because it's not the offices that present a national security concern. It's the app. And you're getting rid of one, not the other. It makes no sense.
So what should Canadian users, listeners to the podcast who have stakes in this, are just curious, just wondering what's going to happen to one of their favorite social media apps, perhaps, what should we know about what's going to happen next? What will you be watching for on this file, for example, in the next 75 days until this executive order expires?
Well, if I'm a Canadian influencer and I'm generating either a lot of revenue or a lot of awareness and career support from TikTok, I'm going to be keeping my eye on what happens in the US, because I want to know if when we get to April 5th, if the app is going to survive or not in the US, because that is going to have an impact that washes over the border, whether I like it or not. And so I would keep an eye on the news cycle to see what happens. I would also start quietly preparing for a potential shutdown. In other words, what is the worst case scenario that if they don't find a buyer by April, that can happen? They might shut down in the US, which of course would have a significant impact in Canada. And so if you're making money off of this platform, you want to put your eggs in more than one basket. If all you're doing is TikTok, you might want to start looking at other platforms. Look at YouTube and Instagram and others and ask yourself, should I be cross-posting to those platforms? Should I be actively messaging my followers to let them know where else I can be found in case TikTok has a problem in a few months? And I think it's a good lesson no matter what happens with this particular case. If social media is your career, you should be not putting, holding your breath and using just one app. In other words, spread the risk, use more than one platform so that as the rules and situations and context of one platform change, you can simply move your activity over to another. It's a good risk mitigation strategy, and it means that you're prepared no matter what happens to your platform of choice. And social media platforms rise and fall over time as well. So TikTok may very well be the most popular now, but a few years from now, that may not be the case. And so if you're not sort of always riding the wave of who's most popular, who's most relevant to you now, you might find yourself on the wrong platform at the wrong time. You got to keep your eyes open and see what's happening outside of what's happening in your feed.
It's true. I don't have nearly as many friends on MySpace these days as I used to.
And that's a great example because MySpace was once the dominant social media platform in the early days of social media. And it was a very significant force, particularly in the music industry. A lot of independent artists used their MySpace pages to market themselves to great effect. And then, of course, what happened was MySpace faded as platforms like Facebook and then later Instagram rose to power. If you held on to MySpace to the exclusion of everything else, you were essentially no longer part of the conversation. The same thing could happen to TikTok, and you'll want to apply those lessons from the past into the future.
Carmi Levy, thank you so much for your time today explaining all of this to us. Really appreciate it. If the listeners want to check out some more of your work and follow along with you as we watch this whole situation, where can they find you?
They can find me on social media, including TikTok. And my address across all of them is at Carmi Levy. It's CarmiLevy.
Thank you again for your time today. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much, David.
Again, that is Carmi Levy. He is a tech analyst and a journalist based in London, Ontario. We thank him for his time today. And that was The Big Story. You can send us feedback on this episode or any other episode, hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca, or leave us a voicemail, 416-935-5935. We love hearing from you. You can find the show on the Seeker app or on any of your other favorite podcast platforms. Please remember to rate, review, follow, and share. I'm David Smith. Until next time, thank you for listening.